Good morning, everybody. Thank you. In terms of Nacro, we have chosen to ban the box, and as Nicola said, I'm going to talk you through how we looked to do that. So I will point out that prior to banning the box, although Nacro had a tick box in place, we always made positive statements in relation to employing people with criminal convictions. So we have always been a big supporter, as we would given the nature of what we do, of employing people with criminal convictions. In terms of some of the reasons why, and I think Nicola's touched on this, we found that the problem with the tick box up front was that a significant proportion of working age population do actually have a criminal record, and therefore 9.2 million people in the UK actually have a criminal record of various different degrees. Reoffending costs an estimated 11 to 13 billion pounds a year in the UK. And employment vetting checks have risen since their implementation in 2002. So just to give you a few stats, in 2002 to 2003, 1.4 million applications were made to the CRB DBS. In 2011 to 2012, that jumped to 4.2 million. And one of the things that Nacro feels is that and many employers carry out actually unlawful DBS checks. It's a common misconception that you have to have a DBS check for various roles just because you work potentially in something like a school but you don't have any contact with children. So that's what we found one of the problems were. We also found that, as Nicola has already alluded to, 75% of employers would use a declaration of criminal record up front to actually reject a candidate outright. And 1 in 7 would reject any applicant with a criminal record regardless of the nature and relevance of the offence. And I think that was touched upon by Zara in terms of the degree of the offence doesn't really matter to some organisations. It's just the fact that somebody had a criminal conviction. Ex-offenders have a largely negative reputation among employers who don't have any experience of working with them. And again, research shows that many individuals with criminal histories pose no greater risk to people, to an organisation, than those with no criminal history. Nacro has found that people with criminal convictions can be equally qualified, reliable and trustworthy, and because of gaining employment, they're less likely to recommit offences. And through the very nature of that, people who are in work, it means that we have the opportunity to gain better workers and better citizens in the UK. In terms of why Nacro chose to formally ban the box, given the nature of what Nacro does and the fact that we deliver policy and training to other employers on this issue, we felt that it was only right and proper that Nacro adopted ban the box. And so therefore we adapted our own safer recruitment policies and practices. And we now only ask disclosure questions at a later and more appropriate stage in the recruitment process. And Nacro's rationale for this is that we want to ensure that we give applicants the opportunity to apply for roles first and foremost on their merits and ability to do the job, and not based on their criminal past. And there's a quote that's just come up on the screen, which is from Graham Beach, who is our acting Chief Executive Officer, and he's also a strong supporter of Ban the Box. So Graham believes that this campaign will help employers to consider applicants first and foremost on their merits, and then this should enable people who have put their criminal past behind them to get back into work so that they can become more productive, financially independent members of society. And alongside that, it links in with Nacro's mission statement, which is changing lives and reducing crime. So how did we actually go about doing and making the changes to Ban the Box? The first thing that we had to consider was that we actually have an online application form, and therefore any changes to that had to be scheduled in and made with our third-party supplier. So we worked with our third-party supplier to change some of the wording on our portal, remove the tick box section, put some positive action statements into our equal opportunity section of the application form, and make it very clear that we were no longer asking people to tick a box. So the types of positive action statements that Nacro put into their application form was that we made people aware that we recognise the contribution that ex-offenders can make to an organisation, and we understand that gaining employment enables them to put the criminal past behind them. We also made a positive statement about being a supporter of Ban the Box campaign, and we explained why we felt that it was more appropriate to ask at a later stage in the recruitment process. And we also reinforced the fact that we wanted to consider people on their skills, experience and ability above and beyond everything else. We also provided applicants at that stage with further information on the type of roles that they were applying for. So Nacro, on the whole, has roles which aren't covered by the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act and therefore qualify for a disclosure and barring service check. We have a small proportion of roles that don't fall into that category, and we felt it was appropriate to explain the two differences to our candidates who were applying for roles. So therefore we gave them a brief introduction and information on what each of those categories meant, and we also provided them with information on where they could go to find out more information on which roles are covered by the Act and when cautions or convictions are spent, etc. So we gave them lots of information to help them to understand whether or not we would be looking to take their convictions, cautions, reprimands, etc. into account or not. So once we had done all of that, we then formally launched, and we decided that for Nacro it was more appropriate that we actually carried out the disclosure at shortlist stage. So this is where applicants have applied for the role. We have shortlisted them based purely on their skills, expertise and experience, and at that stage when they're invited to interview we ask them to disclose if they have a criminal conviction or not. We have two sorts of disclosure forms. So we have a disclosure form that is sent to any candidates who are subject to a disclosure and barring service check. And we also have a separate disclosure form for those roles or candidates who aren't subject to that. And the reason that we chose to have two different forms is because you do have to ask slightly different questions of each. And also we wanted to reaffirm the positive statements about the fact that we would employ people with a criminal conviction, that it didn't necessarily bar them from the post. But of course, with roles that are subject to a DBS check, we had to make sure that people were more aware of the types of roles that they should and shouldn't be applying for, and also what they should and shouldn't disclose. So we chose to have two separate forms. We ask that they complete that honestly, and we give them a guide on how they can complete it. So we talk about things such as when we are looking at their disclosure, that we will take into consideration things such as whether the conviction is relevant to the post, the seriousness of the offence, the age of the applicant at the time of the offence, the length of time since the offence occurred, if there's a pattern of reoffending behaviour, the circumstances that surround the offence, and if the applicant's circumstances have changed since that offence was committed. So we give them guidance on the types of things that we'll be talking to them about should they disclose a criminal past or offending past to us. And hopefully by giving them this form, it gives them a little bit more comfort in the fact that we're not just going through an exercise of gathering information to further screen people out of the process. We're gathering that information so that we can have a sensible and realistic discussion with them at interview stage. And I will point out that whilst we do it at interview stage, we ask our hiring managers to make sure that it's discussed at the end of the interview, and we further reaffirm to the candidate that it won't overtake the interview, i.e. we won't focus all our attention on the fact that they have disclosed something to us. It will be a very small part of the interview process. If the applicant does disclose that they have a criminal past, we will then have a discussion with them, as I've referred to. And at that stage, if they're offered a position with Nacro and they are subject to a DBS check, we would then wait until the DBS certificate came back and ask that if it's unclear, that they send it into Nacro where a risk assessment will be carried out. So the risk assessments are undertaken first and foremost by the head of HR, who will go through a series of risk assessment questions based on the disclosure certificate, and he will ask similar questions to what I have referred to earlier: the relevance of the conviction, the age of it, the age of the applicant at the time, etc., etc. Once that's been completed, the head of HR may or may not ask for a further meeting to be held with the applicant and the hiring manager if further questions need to be asked at that stage. If that's the case, we would refer back to the manager to ask that a meeting is set up, and with our guidance that they ask further questions of that individual. If at the head of HR stage we feel that there is no need to ask any further questions, we would just make a recommendation that that person is allowed to continue to be able to apply for work with us, and that we have no problem, subject to all other pre-employment screening being satisfactory, with employing them in the organisation. Once we have concluded the risk assessment process, we would then store their risk assessment on their personnel file with all of the recommendations. At this stage, we would destroy the DBS disclosure certificate because we are not allowed to keep a copy of that. So we would confidentially destroy that, but keep the risk assessment. And we know then that in 3 years' time, if that person still works for us, if a renewal is required, that if the same information comes back up, which no doubt it will, that we don't need to put them through a further risk assessment because we gathered all that up front before they joined us in the organisation. In terms of the reasons why we feel that a disclosure certificate, a disclosure statement, apologies, is better than a tick box. The tick box is very restrictive. It does not allow people to elaborate on what their conviction was, how old they were, their circumstances, etc. Whereas with the disclosure statement, we feel that they have plenty of room to be able to put their side of the story across, that they feel empowered because they have already been invited to interview, and they feel that they are joining an organisation where having a criminal background doesn't bar them from obtaining a job with us. And on the disclosure statement, we ask them to consider their positive statements and the types of things that they should put in it. So we say to them that it's appropriate for them to tell us why they're applying to this job, and it may be that they say they're applying because they've got an offending background and they want to help people with who are offenders currently. We ask them to tell us things like what makes them think they can do the job, tell us about their offences, when they committed them, why, how they felt at the time, how they feel now coming out of the other side of it, how can they make us feel sure that they're not a risk to the organisation, and what's made their life different now. And that for me is the key, because obviously it gives them the ability to put all this up front, and there's no surprises on either side when the DBS certificate comes back. Everybody knows that there will be something on it, but we know that we've already dealt with it 90% by having a disclosure statement in place. And for advice and guidance, we do have a resettlement helpline. So we have a helpline that is for individuals who apply for roles, and we've also got an employer helpline, and the details are up on the screen now.